blow to Donald Trump, Judge Aileen Cannon denied one of his team's motions to dismiss the classified documents case this week, rejecting claims that the Espionage Act was, quote, unfairly vague when used against a former president. She also showed skepticism over dismissing charges based on the Presidential Records Act, saying, quote, it's difficult to see how this gets you to a dismissal of the indictment. Katie Phang and Anthony Coley are back with us.
On this one, Anthony, I just have I have some real issues with this judge in this case. I want to call your attention to political reporting that at the end of Thursday's session, Cannon promised to rule promptly on the two issues argued, but she made no mention at all of the schedule for a trial, how close she is to resolving a wide array of other legal issues raised by the case, or even when other defense motions may be argued. My truth is this. She don't want to move this thing along because this pace helps Trump. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but I'm looking objectively at this process here, and particularly how I feel in so many ways she's found a way to put her finger more on the scale than I think she should, as opposed to sitting back as an arbiter of facts and the process and going, let's keep this going, people.
I agree with you 1,000%. I think the motion was frivolous and necessary. The day-long hearing on Thursday was frivolous and unnecessary. One of the things that I know from my time at DOJ, and Katie Phang knows this as well, is that the government wins upwards of 95% of these types of cases that deal with retention, unauthorized retention of classified unclassified documents. And Judge Aileen Cannon knows this, right? And so she's trying, to your point, I think, of even preventing this trial from starting, right? I think she's trying to fix the fight before the fight gets started. And the thing about this case is that the evidence is overwhelming here, and it includes videotape from Mar-a-Lago. It includes photographic evidence. And importantly, it includes firsthand witness accounts, right? These are not people who may have overheard something from somebody's second cousin at a coffee shop.
They were direct actors.
These were direct actors.
Literally moved the boxes.
And who have been Mar-a-Lago employees for years, in some cases decades.
Amazing.
You know, Katie, you cannot divorce, in my mind, what we saw in the courtroom this week with Judge Cannon from what we also saw on Capitol Hill this week with the testimony of Robert Hur, the special counsel that was investigating President Biden's classified documents case. I mean, Donald Trump had literally tried to make the case that he and Biden's document situation was the same, and because of that, this is a political prosecution because President Biden himself is not being charged. And Robert Hur, in his report, said that it in fact was different. I'm wondering how you saw Judge Cannon's courtroom antics, if you will, this week, and juxtaposed with Robert Hur on Capitol Hill.
Well, for one thing, I'm just going to add to what Anthony did for his recitation of the evidence, him and Michael. You have Donald Trump admitting that he took the records, saying that he had them, that he kept them, and he had this bizarre, completely illegal interpretation of the Presidential Records Act saying that he was allowed to make them personal. Putting that aside, last I checked, there's only one president or former president that has been indicted for violating the Espionage Act, obstruction, falsities, and wrongful and illegal retention of classified documents, and that's Donald Trump. It's not Joe Biden. Mike Pence wasn't even prosecuted for it. So the one thing that Hur did well, in his report and what he did in Congress this week, he re-emphasized, when questioned, the blatant distinction between what Joe Biden did and what Donald Trump did. And it hinged 100% on intent. Illegal, corrupt, wrongful intent to be able to retain documents that didn't belong to you. Joe Biden, when questioned, turned them back over, assisted, opened up his home, said, please come in. As we know with Donald Trump, and as it was set forth in the recitation in Hur's report, you could even see what Donald Trump did wrong. And I think that, Simone, is what America should have taken away from that Hur congressional hearing, not that Joe Biden did anything wrong.
I want to just take a listen to some of the sound from that hearing. This is Congressman Eric Swalwell pressing her on future Trump appointments. Take a listen.
You want to be perceived, understandably, as credible. And so I want to first see if you will pledge to not accept an appointment from Donald Trump if he is elected again as president.
Congressman, I'm not here to testify
Seems like an easy
about
answer.
what will happen in the
Considering
future.
what I just laid out.
I'm here to talk about the report and the work that went into it. And
But you don't want to be associated with that guy again, do you?
Congressman, I'm not here to offer any opinions about what may or may not happen in the future. I'm here to talk about the work that went into the report, which I stand by.
Anthony, I want to know what you made of that exchange, but also just what this means for integrity at DOJ itself.
Right. Alicia, I was at the Justice Department at the time of this appointment. I talked to Robert Hur myself as head of the Office of Public Affairs, and we all had high hopes, really, that Robert Hur would do what he was assigned to do, and that is to call balls and strikes as they are, to be apolitical. I think in retrospect, and I say this as somebody who has a great deal of respect for the Attorney General, I think in retrospect, the Attorney General made the wrong choice in selecting Robert Hur to be special counsel. I think Garland should have appointed a special counsel who was perhaps at the end of a distinguished legal career, and not someone who was mid-career. Robert Hur is early 50s, and in my opinion, he wrote a report that was designed to safeguard his employment in a future Republican administration.
Katie, I want to get your reaction to an interesting exchange between Jim Jordan and Adam Schiff during the Hur hearing. Take a quick listen to this.
Joe Biden broke the law, but because he's a forgetful old man who would appear sympathetic to a jury, Mr. Hur chose not to bring charges.
You understood when you made that decision, didn't you, Mr. Hur, that you would ignite a political firestorm with that language, didn't you?
Congressman, politics played no part whatsoever in my investigative steps.
But you understood nevertheless,
the words
didn't
that
you,
I put in
Mr.
my.
Katie, it really touches on exactly what Anthony was just saying. How do you see this moment in miniature when you look at everything as an example of the complexities, yes, but also the problem that we are in right now, where everything is beaten down and bloodied by the politics, and you cannot look at the behavior of an independent actor like a Mr. Hur without thinking, well, you know, you saw him as a sympathetic old man and you chose not to charge him, implying what? Or, you know, you want to find some political advantage by, you know, taking advantage of an opportunity to get an appointment from the next president, if that's the case. How do you assess this moment when you hear these types of responses?
Michael, the answer is simple. Words matter. Words matter. And that is what Adam Schiff was trying to discuss with Robert Hur. Hur's choice to include language that from a prosecutorial standpoint was relevant, right? It was a part of the analysis as to why he would not prosecute this case, but it was not relevant to the analysis of whether or not a crime had been committed. That's the distinction. As a prosecutor, you do take into an assessment whether or not there is a sympathetic defendant, sympathetic witness, sympathetic victim, maybe a not credible victim, not credible witness, whatever. Those things come into play. But for purposes of Robert Hur's job, that was not supposed to be included in his report. The Joe Biden is a sympathetic, forgetful old man is the same as the McAfee odor of mendacity. That is what's happening there. The addition of words, because words matter, creates fodder and ammunition for the other side to use in a way that misleads the American public. When you mislead the American public and you say stuff like forgetful old man, it just gives ammunition for the other side to go after Joe Biden. Footnote, and actually it's not even a footnote, it should be the title of any type of newspaper or media chyron. Donald Trump is incompetent. Donald Trump is the forgetful old man, right? So that is really the headline. It is not that Joe Biden comes across as a sympathetic old man.